There's something about watching someone at the top of their game unravel that feels both unsettling and strangely satisfying. Imagine a man who has everything: money, power, status, but can't walk into a room full of women without his chest tightening like a vice. That was Nathan Cole, the self-made millionaire everyone envied but no one truly understood. On paper, he had it all: a sleek penthouse overlooking the city skyline, a fleet of luxury cars in his garage, and a business empire that made headlines weekly. But behind closed doors, Nathan lived with a secret so suffocating it nearly broke him: a paralyzing fear of women. Yes, you heard that right. The same man who could command boardrooms and negotiate million-dollar deals couldn't even hold eye contact with a woman without feeling his pulse race uncontrollably. Nathan wasn't always this way. In fact, growing up, he was the kind of guy people described as charming or confident. He played sports, aced exams, and had a knack for making friends. But somewhere along the line, things changed. Maybe it started with rejection, or maybe it was something deeper, buried beneath layers of insecurities and unspoken fears. Whatever the root cause, by the time Nathan hit his 30s, panic attacks became his constant companion whenever women were around. It didn't matter if they were colleagues, acquaintances, or strangers. Just being near them triggered a storm inside him he couldn't control. And yet, despite his crippling anxiety, Nathan managed to keep his life together, or so it seemed. His wealth acted as a shield, creating distance between him and the world, especially the opposite sex. But then she walked into his life. Her name was Alina Vega, and from the moment Nathan first saw her across a crowded charity gala, he knew she was different. She wasn't dressed to impress like the other guests, nor did she carry herself with the calculated poise of someone trying to climb social ladders. Instead, there was an authenticity about her, a quiet confidence that drew people in without effort. Alina worked as a freelance journalist, covering human interest stories that often went unnoticed by mainstream media. To say she came from a different world than Nathan would be an understatement. Yet fate, or perhaps something more mysterious, had brought them together that night, setting off a chain of events neither of them could have predicted. The irony wasn't lost on Nathan. Here he was, a man who prided himself on controlling every aspect of his life, completely undone by the mere presence of one woman. At first, he tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just another fleeting infatuation. But Alina wasn't easy to ignore. She had a way of slipping past his defenses, asking questions that forced him to confront parts of himself he'd rather leave buried. And while Nathan struggled to maintain his composure around her, Alina remained unfazed, treating him not as some untouchable millionaire, but simply as a person. For the first time in years, Nathan felt seen not for his money or success, but for who he really was underneath it all. As their paths continued to cross, Nathan found himself caught in a whirlwind of emotions he didn't know how to handle. On one hand, he wanted nothing more than to get closer to Alina, to understand what it was about her that made him feel alive again. On the other hand, the thought of letting her in terrified him. What if she discovered his secret? What if she saw him for the broken man he believed himself to be? These questions haunted him day and night, gnawing at his resolve until he could barely think straight. Still, he couldn't stay away. Every conversation with Alina left him craving more, even as his anxiety threatened to consume him whole. It wasn't long before their interactions took a turn neither of them expected. One evening, after weeks of tiptoeing around each other, Alina cornered Nathan during a networking event. They stood on a balcony overlooking the glittering city below, the air thick with tension. Alina had been teasing him about his tendency to avoid direct answers, her laughter light but persistent. Nathan, flustered and overwhelmed, stammered through a response, his usual charm deserting him entirely. Then, out of nowhere, Alina leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't a grand, cinematic moment, just a soft, unexpected brush of lips that sent shockwaves through Nathan's entire being. For a brief second, the world stopped spinning. All his fears, doubts, and anxieties melted away, replaced by a sensation so raw and powerful it scared him more than anything ever had. When the kiss ended, Nathan froze, unable to process what had just happened. His mind raced, torn between exhilaration and sheer panic. Alina, seemingly unfazed, gave him a small smile before stepping back, leaving him standing there like a statue. "You looked like you needed that," she said simply, her tone playful yet tinged with something deeper. And with that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd before Nathan could muster a coherent response. He stood there for what felt like hours, replaying the moment over and over in his head. What did it mean? Why had she done it? And most importantly, why couldn't he stop thinking about it? That night marked a turning point for Nathan, though he didn't realize it at the time. Something inside him shifted, cracking open a part of his soul he'd kept locked away for years. The kiss hadn't just been a fleeting moment of connection, had awakened something primal, something he couldn't ignore. But with that awakening came a flood of uncertainty. Could he let go of his fears and embrace whatever this thing with Alina might become? Or would his anxiety ultimately push her away, leaving him lonelier than ever before? The answers eluded him, but one thing was clear. He couldn't go back to the way things were. Not after tasting freedom even, if only for a moment. Meanwhile, Alina carried her own secrets, ones she hadn't shared with anyone, least of all Nathan. Beneath her calm exterior lay a complexity that mirrored Nathan's in surprising ways. She too had faced battles within herself, struggles that shaped the person she was today. Their chance encounter wasn't random. There was purpose behind it, threads of fate weaving them together in ways neither fully understood. As much as Nathan grappled with his feelings, Alina wrestled with her own demons, wondering if opening up to someone like Nathana, man whose life bore little resemblance to hers, was worth the risk. Yet, every time their eyes met, doubt gave way to possibility, fueling a connection that refused to fade. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that kiss lingered like a ghost between them. Nathan tried to focus on work, throwing himself into projects to distract from the chaos brewing inside him. But no matter how hard he worked, Elena's face kept surfacing in his thoughts, her voice echoing in his ears. He replayed their conversations, dissecting every word, every glance, searching for clues about where they stood or where they might go. Meanwhile, Alina seemed determined to remain a mystery, offering glimpses of vulnerability here and there but never fully revealing herself. It was maddening and intoxicating all at once. Their next meeting came unexpectedly during a rainy afternoon at a local cafe. Nathan had ducked inside to escape the downpour, only to find Alina sitting by the window, sipping coffee and scribbling notes in a worn leather journal. For a moment, he considered turning around and leaving, afraid of what might happen if he approached her. But curiosity got the better of him, and he found himself pulling out the chair opposite hers. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Alina looked up, surprise flickering across her features before she smiled. Only if you promise not to run away this time, she teased, her words light but loaded with meaning. Nathan chuckled nervously, taking a seat as the rain continued to pour outside. Sealing them in a bubble of intimacy, neither was ready to acknowledge. What followed was a conversation unlike any they'd had before, gone with the guarded pleasantries and polite small talk. Instead, they delved into topics that revealed pieces of themselves they rarely showed others. Nathan spoke candidly about his struggles, his voice trembling as he admitted how much unsettled him in the best possible way. Alina listened intently, her gaze soft yet piercing, encouraging him to keep going even when the words caught in his throat. When it was her turn to share, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. There was pain in her past, scars that still hadn't healed, but she trusted Nathan enough to let him see a fraction of it. By the time they parted ways, both felt changed, as though the weight they'd been carrying had lessened, if only slightly. Yet, for all the progress they made, unresolved tension simmered beneath the surface. Nathan still wrestled with his fear of losing control, while Alina battled the fear of letting someone in too deep. Neither knew where the other stood, and the uncertainty hung heavy between them, casting a shadow over their budding connection. Would they find a way to bridge the gap between them, or would their differences prove insurmountable? The question loomed large, unanswered, leaving both of them teetering on the edge of something neither dared name. And so, the story continues, suspended in that fragile space between hope and doubt. Nathan returned home that evening, his mind swirling with thoughts of Alina and the undeniable pull she exerted on him. He stared out the window of his penthouse, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and silver as raindrops slid down. The glass, for the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future where he wasn't defined by his fears of future, where Alina might play a role. Nathan's life had always been a balancing act, though few people knew it. On the surface, he was the epitome of success, a man who exuded confidence and control. But beneath the polished exterior lay a labyrinth of insecurities that stemmed from his childhood. Growing up, Nathan had idolized his father, a stern but brilliant businessman who believed vulnerability was a weakness. "Men like us don't show fear," he'd say, his voice cold and unyielding. Those words became etched into Nathan's psyche, shaping how he navigated the world. As a teenager, he learned to mask his emotions, burying them under layers of ambition and perfectionism. By the time he reached adulthood, he'd built an empire, but at what cost? The older he got, the more isolated he felt, as if every achievement only widened the chasm between him and everyone else. The panic attacks began in college, though he didn't recognize them for what they were at first. It started with small things, avoiding group projects where women were involved, dodging invitations to parties where he might have to mingle. At the time, he told himself it was just stress or overwork, but deep down, he knew there was something deeper at play. Particularly traumatic breakup during his sophomore year sealed the deal. His girlfriend, Sarah, had called him out on his emotional distance one too many times, accusing him of being incapable of love. Her words stung because they hit too close to home. When she finally walked away, Nathan convinced himself it was better this way. He threw himself into his studies and later his career, using work as both a shield and a distraction. Over time, his anxiety around women morphed into full-blown panic attacks, leaving him paralyzed in their presence. And yet, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was missing from his life. Alina, on the other hand, carried her own scars, though hers weren't born of privilege or ambition. Raised by a single mother in a working-class neighborhood, she grew up watching her mum struggle to make ends meet while battling depression. Money, or the lack of it, was a constant source of tension in their household, and Alina often found herself playing peacemaker, trying to keep the peace when bills piled up and tempers flared. Despite the hardships, her mother instilled in her a fierce independence and a belief in the power of storytelling. "Stories change lives," she'd say, her eyes lighting up whenever Alina brought home a new book. That passion stayed with Alina throughout her life, guiding her toward journalism as a way to give voice to those who couldn't speak for themselves. But even as she pursued her dreams, she wrestled with feelings of inadequacy, wondering if she'd ever truly measure up, not just to others' expectations, but to her own. Their worlds collided not by chance, but through a series of events neither could have anticipated. The charity gala where they first met wasn't something Nathan typically attended. He usually sent a representative instead. But that night, he'd needed an escape, a break from the relentless grind of his company's latest acquisition. Alina, meanwhile, had been assigned to cover the event for a local magazine. She hadn't planned on staying long, intending to grab a few quotes and leave. Yet fate had other plans. As Nathan stood awkwardly near the bar, nursing a drink and scanning the room like a man trapped, Alina spotted him immediately. There was something about the way he held himself, rigid, yet oddly vulnerable, that caught her attention. Curiosity got the better of her, and before she knew it, she was approaching him, notebook in hand, ready to ask questions that would unravel far more than either of them bargained for. Over the weeks that followed, their interactions grew more frequent, each encounter peeling back another layer of their carefully constructed facades. Nathan discovered that Alina wasn't just the confident journalist she appeared to be. Beneath her composed demeanor lay a woman who doubted herself constantly, haunted by the fear that she'd never live up to her potential. For her part, Alina saw glimpses of the real Nathan, the man behind the money, and realized how much he craved connection, even if he didn't know how to ask for it. Their conversations became a dance of sorts, each step tentative yet deliberate, drawing them closer while keeping them tethered to their respective fears. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing pieces of themselves in fragmented bursts that left both craving more. But the closer they got, the more complicated things became. Nathan's panic attacks intensified, triggered not just by Alina's presence, but by the mere thought of her. He'd lie awake at night, replaying their moments together, torn between longing and dread. What if he messed things up? What if she saw him for the broken man he believed himself to be? These questions gnawed at him, fueling his anxiety until it consumed him whole. Meanwhile, Alina wrestled with her own doubts. Was she setting herself up for heartbreak by pursuing someone so deeply entrenched in his own pain? Could she handle the weight of his struggles on top of her own? The uncertainty weighed heavily on her, casting a shadow over the fragile bond they were building. The turning point came unexpectedly. During a weekend getaway, Nathan had impulsively suggested, desperate to prove to himself and, perhaps to Alina, he could overcome his fears, he invited her to join him at a secluded cabin in the mountains. It was a bold move, one that terrified him almost as much as it excited him. Alina hesitated before accepting, unsure if she was ready to take such a leap. But something about the raw honesty in Nathan's voice compelled her to say yes. The trip promised solitude, beauty, and the possibility of clarity, a chance for both of them to confront the walls they'd built around themselves. From the moment they arrived, the air crackled with tension. The cabin was rustic, yet charming, surrounded by towering trees and breathtaking views. But neither Nathan nor Alina could fully relax. Every glance, every word exchanged felt charged with meaning, as though they were tiptoeing around a truth neither was ready to face. On the second day, they decided to hike to a nearby waterfall. The trail was steep and winding, forcing them to focus on the path ahead rather than the storm brewing between them. By the time they reached the waterfall, exhaustion mingled with exhilaration, creating a rare moment of authenticity. Standing there, surrounded by nature's grandeur, Nathan found himself opening up in ways he never had before. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Alina turned to look at him, surprise flickering across her features. "Of what?" she asked gently, though she already suspected the answer. Nathan hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "Of messing this up. Of letting you see me for who I really am." His confession hung in the air, heavy and raw. Alina stepped closer, her heart pounding. "You think I don't already see you," she said softly. "I see the man who's afraid to let go, but also the man who's willing to try. That's enough for me." Her words struck a chord deep within him, breaking through the barriers he'd spent years constructing. For a moment, it seemed like they might finally bridge the gap between them. But as they made their way back to the cabin, reality crept in. Nathan's phone buzzed incessantly, reminders of the life he'd temporarily left behind. Each notification pulled him further away, reigniting the anxiety he'd worked so hard to suppress. By the time they returned, the fragile connection they'd forged at the waterfall felt dangerously close to snapping. Alina noticed the shift immediately, her earlier optimism giving way to frustration. "Do you really want this?" she asked, her tone sharper than intended. "Or are you just running away again?" Her question hit its mark, forcing Nathan to confront the truth he'd been avoiding. Did he want a future with Alina, badly enough to fight for it? Or was he destined to remain trapped in his own fears, forever chasing a version of happiness that eluded him? The weight of the decision bore down on him, leaving him breathless. As night fell, they sat in silence, the crackling fire doing little to dispel the chill settling between them. Neither spoke, yet the unspoken words hung thick in the air, building toward a confrontation neither was prepared for. The next morning dawned bright and clear, offering a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing inside them. Nathan woke early, unable to sleep, his mind racing with possibilities and worst-case scenarios. He stepped outside, the crisp mountain air filling his lungs as he tried to steady his thoughts. Alina joined him moments later, her expression guarded, yet resolute. "We need to talk," she said simply, her voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. Nathan nodded, bracing himself for what was to come. They sat on the porch, the vast expanse of wilderness stretching out before them, a reminder of how small their problems were in the grand scheme of things, yet how monumental they felt. In that moment, what followed was a conversation unlike any they'd had before. Gone were the polite evasions and half-truths. Instead, they laid bare their fears, their hopes, and the tangled web of emotions binding them together. Nathan admitted that he'd spent most of his life running from relationships, from intimacy, from himself. Alina confessed that she'd been drawn to him precisely because of his vulnerability, even if she hadn't understood it at first. "But I can't do this alone," she said finally, her voice trembling. "If we're going to figure this out, you have to meet me halfway." Her ultimatum left Nathan reeling. Half of him wanted to run, to retreat back into the safety of his carefully controlled world. The moments stretched endlessly, the weight of Elena's words pressing down on Nathan like a physical force. He stared at her, his mind racing through every fear, every doubt that had held him back for so long. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the clarity of the mountain air or the raw honesty in Elena's gaze. But for the first time, Nathan didn't feel the urge to run. Instead, he felt an deep, undeniable longing to stay, to fight for what they could become. Together, taking a shaky breath, he reached out and took her hand in his. The warmth of her skin grounding him in a way nothing else ever had. "I'm scared," he admitted again, his voice rough with emotion. "But I don't want to lose you, not because of my fears." Elena's eyes softened, though she didn't say anything right away. She simply squeezed his hand, letting him know she was there, not just as someone who saw his flaws, but as someone willing to stand by him despite them. In that silence, Nathan found a strength he didn't know he possessed. For years, he'd defined himself by control and perfection, believing vulnerability was weakness. But sitting there with Elena, he realized the opposite was true. Opening up, letting go, was the bravest thing he could do. Their conversation continued late into the morning, each word chipping away at the walls they'd built around themselves. Nathan shared stories about his father, about the pressure to be invincible that had shaped so much of his life. Elena listened intently, nodding when he spoke of moments she recognized, the ones where fear masqueraded as strength. When it was her turn, she opened up about her own struggles, the guilt of leaving her mother behind to chase her dreams, the constant battle to prove herself in a world that often dismissed her. By the time they finished talking, both felt lighter, as if shedding pieces of baggage they'd carried for far too long. As the day wore on, the tension between them began to shift. It wasn't gone entirely, how could it be, when so much still lay ahead? But it transformed into something more hopeful, more tangible. They spent the afternoon exploring the woods, laughing over silly jokes and sharing quiet moments that spoke louder than words. For the first time, Nathan allowed himself to relax, to let Elena see him not as the millionaire or the anxious man, but simply as Nathan. And Elena, in turn, let her guard down, revealing glimpses of the playful, carefree side she rarely showed to anyone. But the real test came later that evening, when reality threatened to intrude once again. As they prepared dinner together in the cabin's tiny kitchen, Nathan's phone buzzed incessantly, each notification a reminder of the life waiting for him outside their secluded bubble. At first, he ignored it, determined to focus on the present. But as the calls grew more urgent, he knew he couldn't shut out the world forever. With a heavy sigh, he stepped outside to take the call, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts. It was a board member, demanding updates on a critical deal that required Nathan's immediate attention. The conversation was brief but jarring, pulling Nathan back into the high-stakes world he'd temporarily escaped. When he returned to the cabin, Elena was sitting by the fire, her expression unreadable. "Work calling?" she asked, her tone neutral but tinged with resignation. Nathan nodded, sinking onto the couch beside her. "Yeah, they need me back in the city tomorrow." For a moment, neither spoke. The looming deadline hung between them, a stark reminder of the lives they'd put on hold for this weekend. Elena broke the silence first, her voice soft but firm. "You have to decide, Nathan. Are you going to keep running from this, or are you ready to face it head?" Her question wasn't just about the trip. It was about everything. His fears, his doubts, the future they might build together if he chose to try. Nathan looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just the woman he'd fallen for, but the mirror she'd become, a reflection of his own potential, his own capacity for change. He thought about all the times he'd let fear dictate his choices, pushing people away before they could get too close. He thought about the loneliness he'd endured, convincing himself it was better than risking heartbreak. And then he thought about Alina, her kindness, her patience, her unwavering belief in him even when he struggled to believe in himself. Slowly, a sense of resolve washed over him. "I'm not running anymore," he said finally, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Whatever happens next, I want to face it with you." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled, reaching out to cup his face in her hands. "Then we'll figure it out together," she whispered. The simple promise carried a weight. Neither fully understood yet, but it was enough for now. The next morning, they packed up the cabin and headed back to the city, the journey marked by a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. Once home, Nathan threw himself into work with renewed focus, using the tools Alina had unknowingly given him to manage his anxiety. He started therapy, confronting the roots of his panic attacks and learning healthier ways to cope. Meanwhile, Alina continued pursuing her passion for storytelling, finding inspiration in the complexities of human connection, including her own relationship with Nathan. That their path wasn't without challenges. There were days when Nathan's old fears resurfaced, threatening to pull him under. And there were moments when Alina questioned whether she was strong enough to support him while navigating her own struggles. But through it all, they leaned on each other, choosing communication over silence, trust over doubt. Over time, their bond deepened, becoming a testament to the power of vulnerability and resilience. Months later, Nathan stood on the balcony of his penthouse, watching the city lights flicker below. Alina joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist as she rested her head against his shoulder. "Remember that weekend in the mountains?" she asked, her voice teasing. Nathan chuckled, pulling her closer. "How could I forget? It changed everything." They stayed like that for a while, content in the quiet certainty of their love. Looking back, Nathan realized that losing control, that kiss that had sent his world spinning, had been the best thing that ever happened to him. It forced him to confront the fears he'd buried for so long and opened the door to a life richer than any amount of money could buy. Alina taught him that true strength wasn't about never being afraid. It was about facing your fears anyway, one step at a time. And in return, Nathan gave Alina the courage to dream bigger, to believe that she deserved happiness as much as anyone else. As the story comes to a close, one thing is clear: love isn't about finding someone perfect, it's about embracing imperfection, yours and theirs, and building something beautiful out of it. Nathan and Elena's journey reminds us that growth often begins in the messiest, most unexpected places. Whether it's a kiss that shakes you to your core or a conversation that changes the way you see yourself, these moments shape us, challenge us, and ultimately make us whole. So here's to taking chances, to leaning into discomfort, and to discovering the extraordinary connections waiting just beyond our fears. Because sometimes, all it takes is one brave step to rewrite your story and maybe even find the love you never knew you needed.